Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. I'm Martin Jones and this episode marks the end of our third series. What you're about to hear is a recording of a briefing that I delivered to an audience of specialist military personnel. It focuses on sleep as a core performance capability, a simple way to identify sleep debt, what sleep is and how it works, and the final part on how to improve sleep in real-world conditions. If you followed the podcast, you will recognize that many of these ideas have come from several previous episodes, and this session brings them together into a single applied framework. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with some new episodes, but until then, please enjoy this episode and thank you for listening. I'm Martin Jones, performance psychologist and sleep specialist, and today I'm going to talk you through sleep and why it's important for your performance. Before I do that, I want you to answer some questions. I want you to just simply answer yes or no. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, do you rely on an alarm clock to wake you up in the morning? Yes or no? The second is, do you fall asleep as soon as your head hits the pillow? Within 5 minutes, for example, of getting into bed, you are fast asleep. Third question is, do you rely on caffeine to stay awake during the daytime? Next, do you ever find yourself nodding off in long meetings? Do you find yourself sleeping longer during the week compared to the weekend or when you're on leave or on holiday? Do you ever find yourself nodding off in front of a television? Do you get the elbow in the side from a loved one telling you that you're snoring during their favorite show? And finally, have you ever found yourself falling asleep at the wheel of a car? Now, these questions are essentially asking you about sleep debt, sleep fragmentation, sleep restriction. We can use many different terms, but ultimately we're trying to find out whether you have sufficient sleep or not. Now, if you've answered no to all of those previous questions, chances are you don't have a sleep debt. You're sleeping quite well and you have sufficient sleep duration most nights. If you've answered yes to one or two of those questions, you're probably carrying a slight sleep debt. If you've answered yes to all of them, you're probably carrying a significant sleep debt. And hopefully this talk will provide you with some information that you can use to reverse that sleep debt and to improve your sleep. And by doing so, improve your health and your well-being, your relationships, and your job-specific performance. So how are we going to do this? Well, over the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to cover three really important topics. We're going to start by asking the question, what is sleep? We're going to dive into this strange phenomenon that we do every day for our entire lives, pretty much, and try to understand what exactly is it and what isn't sleep, what is it not. We're then going to look at why sleep is important. Why does it matter to us? And what happens when we don't get sufficient sleep? And then finally, we're going to wrap up with something to take away, some practical applied strategies that you can take away and use to improve your sleep, to optimize your sleep on a nightly basis, and maybe even get sleep that little bit better when the opportunity for sleep is suboptimal. So for example, in arduous conditions, maybe in extreme temperatures, or when you don't necessarily sleep in the most comfortable of environments. So we're going to start by considering what is sleep. We might think of sleep as a quirk of evolution, something that's almost gone wrong, that actually puts us at risk of thwarting many of our basic biological needs. What I mean by that is when we're asleep, we are usually lying down. We usually have our eyes closed. We don't respond to the environment. So from an evolutionary point of view, you think that would put us at a disadvantage because we're now at risk of predation. We're at risk of being attacked by rival tribes. Environmental events could influence our well-being. We can't run away from fires or floods. And when we're asleep, we just don't respond to the environment. So in a lot of ways, you might think that sleep is actually something that evolution has almost got wrong, that we should actually try and get rid of it. Now, if we look at sleep across all species, we will see that every species sleeps. If we look at the smallest of insects like the fruit fly or nematode worms like a C. elegans worm with very simple neural structures, they all sleep all the way through the animal kingdom. Some animals have quirky sleep. So for example, certain species of aquatic mammal like dolphins or harbor seals and even some birds can sleep one hemisphere at a time, so that if they're flying across a large ocean, they can sleep while still on the wing, or if they're diving into the water, they can sleep whilst they are swimming and breathing and coming up for water so that these aquatic mammals don't drown. But even though it's quirky and maybe the sleep that these animals have is not equivalent to human sleep, they do have this period within their cycle, their life cycle, where they are sleeping. That's an important thing to consider. All things sleep. Now, if you were to live to the age of 90, you'd spend approximately 30 years of your lifespan in sleep. Roughly a third of our life, approximately 30 years of our life will be spent in this period of sleep. So whether it's an evolutionary quirk or not, we must recognize that it must be doing something really, really important for every species to maintain this aspect of their life and to spend such a long period of existence in this stage. What we know about sleep is not one thing. It's not just a unitary state. It is a multiphasic state. It is ordered and hierarchical, and it's made up of different stages or phases of sleep. Each of those phases is essential for what we need to do during the day, and we need them for our entirety of our lives. The best way of understanding this, in my experience, is think of sleep like your diet. Most people will understand that from a nutritional point of view, you need a balanced diet that includes carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and lots of micronutrients. And if you get all of those things in the right amounts in your diet, you typically have a good diet. You have a healthy diet. If we remove any one of those things from our diet, there's often a consequence. If you remove fats from your diet, you sometimes get vitamin deficiencies because some vitamins are fat soluble. If you remove protein from your diet, you don't necessarily repair tissue or grow. If you remove carbohydrates, you're losing a fuel source and you can feel sluggish, and so on and so forth. If you think of your sleep in a similar way, sleep is made up of different stages. And we usually classify these in two ways. We call them REM and non-REM. So REM means rapid eye movement. Non-REM is non-rapid eye movement. Within the non-rapid eye movement stage, there are actually three substages, what are called NREM stage 1, NREM stage 2, and NREM stage 3. And they all do slightly different things for our brain, for our body. We need all of them in different amounts. And this isn't a conscious process. Our body is able to regulate our sleep in a way that we don't have to think about it. We just allow sleep to take over. It's not something we need to consciously do. It's much like many other basic biological functions like breathing and digestion. Sleep is not at the conscious level. And what we'll hopefully find out as we move through this session is the recognition that sometimes thinking can be the thing that actually thwarts sleep. And these different types of stages are represented by different types of brain activity. And we know that these different brain activities correspond to different functions. Remove any one of them and there is a consequence. Much like removing any aspect of your nutrition, there is a consequence. So we need all of these stages. When we plot our sleep cycles throughout a night, we can see how the stages actually change throughout the night. Throughout the span of sleep, we get more of one state than another as sleep goes on. So early on in the nighttime, we typically will go into more slow wave sleep or stage 2 NREM sleep. Whereas if you look at the latter half of the night, the early hours of the morning, we are more REM sleep dominant. The amount of REM, or sometimes considered dreaming sleep, is increased towards the end of the night or the early morning. Now, if we shorten our sleep period, what we're effectively doing is cleaving off those last few hours of the end. So we are selectively reducing REM sleep compared to those other stages. So it's important to understand we need all of those stages because they are doing different things at different times, and we need them all. If we remove any of them, there will be a consequence. If we move on to understand how we sleep, it's actually really quite simple. We've effectively got two systems at play. One of them is like a pump. We are pumping up what we call a sleep pressure. Now, imagine a stand-up paddleboard. If any of you've seen these contraptions, we pump them up full of air. And what's happening is the air is inflating over time as you're pumping away, but the valve is effectively stopping the air coming back out. So that is the first part. The pump is like what we call sleep pressure, or the homeostatic drive for sleep. And this is just increasing with wakefulness. The more you are awake, the longer you are awake, the greater the sleep pressure that builds up. At some point, we then also have a release of that valve, and we call this the circadian alerting system. The circadian alerting system, or the wakeful system, is driving us to be awake as we go through the day. And then we have a period of time, which is a window where our drive for wakefulness is effectively switched off. So we could think of that as the release valve. So imagine the paddleboard analogy. You may have been at the beach and you will have heard that telltale fizz when somebody has pressed the valve and let the air out, and then the paddleboard goes down. That's what's happening with sleep. You're building up the pressure this homeostatic drive, which is actually a chemical. There's various chemicals that we call them somnogens. There's around about 36 known somnogens. The most well studied is something called adenosine. So if we look at how adenosine is building that pressure, the longer we're awake, the greater the pressure. At some point, something is causing the body to press that valve and release that pressure. That something is to do with our circadian rhythm, but it can be to do with light. It can be to do with the amount of light that's now getting in our eyes. What happens when we are awake, when we've got light coming into our eyes, there's a neural circuit which is stopping a hormone from being released. This hormone is called melatonin. As soon as that light goes, once there is no more light hitting these photosensitive cells in our retina, that system is no longer stopping the melatonin from releasing. So melatonin is sometimes known as the darkness hormone or a vampire hormone because it's released in response to darkness. When there is no light, we release melatonin. What it is doing is it's starting a series of events. It's creating a biochemical cascade that will ultimately end in sleep. So when we have sufficiently high sleep pressure at the same time that valve is pressed and then we're allowed to release that pressure, we then fall asleep. And sleep is easy. I'm often asked by people who struggle to sleep, what do good sleepers do? And the answer, not necessarily a satisfying answer, is but they just don't do anything. They rely on that physiological mechanism. They just let go and sleep finds a way that the unconscious takes over, the automatic takes over. And sleep it is a natural process that you don't need to think about. The problem can emerge is when we try and overthink sleep, or we try and apply effort to falling asleep. That can interrupt sleep in quite a big way. So next, if we move on and look at why does sleep matter? Well, sleep serves important physiological, emotional, and cognitive functions throughout our lives. We know through various research studies over many, many years that sleep is essential and it plays a critical role in learning, in memory, in regulation of our mood, as well as many other physiological functions such as hormone production. So we know it's incredibly important. It's not an exaggeration to say that literally everything that we do when we're awake is improved by optimal sleep. And equally, almost everything that we do when we wake is degraded when we do not get sufficient sleep. Now, that level of degradation is different depending on what that task is. So, for example, we know that physiological performance is degraded by sleep, but the degradation that we see in terms of cognitive performance is far greater. So many of the physiological functions, such as the contractibility of the muscle, are not that impaired. They are eventually if you don't sleep enough, but you can still move through space, you can still lift weights. The endurance components of fitness are more affected than strength-based components of fitness, but truth be told, it's probably a cognitive factor that endurance activity just feel harder. We have a change in what's called our perception of effort when we're sleep deprived. The biggest changes that we see is to the cognitive tasks. When we sleep deprive people, their cognitive performance is the thing that is degraded the most. Now, if we look across these different functions, these different cognitive functions, from attention to learning to decision-making to sustained attention, all of these different cognitive or emotional processing variables have been shown to be degraded by poor sleep. This research has been repeated many, many, many times. There's variability across a population. Some people are more robust than others. Some people get very large decreases in their performance. We don't really know how much someone's going to degrade when they're sleep deprived until we sleep deprive them. So there is value in training people to see how they respond to sleep deprivation. But the unfortunate truth is you do not adapt. You can't learn to perform better once sleep deprived. All sleep deprivation does, it just helps to reveal yourself. It helps you to reveal what you're capable of in those situations. You do not get any better, despite what people wish would happen. But ultimately, it's important to recognize that you don't need to worry about your sleep. The beauty of sleep is this incredibly complicated but beautifully orchestrated physiological process is that the body will take over. Sleep will come, just let those automatic processes take over. Much like we can breathe without thinking. Now, the fact I'm talking about breathing now, you probably have drawn your attention to that breathing. Over time, listening to me talk, you'll realize you weren't thinking about your breathing anymore. You've placed your attention somewhere else, but that mechanism of intake of breath and breathing out has kept going. Sleep is the same. If we can move away our attention from sleep, our physiology will just take over. We cannot force ourselves to stay awake when tired. This is why people fall asleep at the wheel of the car, because these fatigue countermeasures simply do not work long term. There is a tipping point where the body will take over and you will fall asleep. So you don't need to worry. Equally, it's important to understand that periods of sleeplessness are perfectly normal. Having the occasional bad night, having the occasional insomnia type symptom is perfectly normal, and it is not really something to concern yourself with. So there's not necessarily something to worry about when it comes to not getting a good night's sleep regularly. And the even better news is that we can treat a lot of these things. We can actually improve your sleep. There are little tweaks, little things that we can do to get you sleeping in a much, much better way. So let's move on to those things. Let's talk about ways that we can improve your sleep. Now, once you understand those two processes, what we call the two-process model, which is the buildup of sleep pressure and the circadian alerting system that's building up, keeping us awake during the day, and then releasing that pressure valve at night. Once we understand those two things, we can start to recognize things that we're doing in the daytime that are potentially thwarting those two processes. So I've mentioned adenosine as an example. Adenosine is a chemical that builds up within your brain, and it fits receptors within your brain cells. A key would fit into a lock. Now, through a quirk of physiology, a quirk of evolution, the caffeine molecule fits that same lock as adenosine. Whereas adenosine is the right key and can turn that lock and causes a biochemical cascade of a neurotransmitter called GABA, caffeine doesn't do that. It simply jams in the lock, and now the key will not turn. So you're stopping that neurobiological cascade of that neurotransmitter. So if we are consuming caffeine throughout the day, we're interrupting that sleep pressure system. So we would need to be very careful about when and how much, the duration and the dosage of caffeine, because taking it at the wrong time can potentially thwart sleep, both in terms of actually helping us fall asleep or what's happening in our brain when we are asleep. Similarly, we can interfere with our circadian rhythm through things like jet lag. When we are moving across time zones, our travel schedule is much quicker than our capacity to catch up from an internal point of view. We can also have similar effects by exercising at the wrong times, potentially eating at the wrong times, or getting insufficient light or getting light at the wrong times. These are behaviors that can interrupt these two processes. So now that we understand that, we can start looking at certain things that can change and can influence our sleep. Before we do that, though, I want to look at a myth around sleep, and this is the 8 hours a night myth. If you go onto social media, you'll probably find thousands of so-called sleep experts, so-called sleep gurus, who'll give you fairly standard advice around sleep, and they might say things like you need to get 8 hours a night. Whilst some people do need 8 hours, the amount of sleep that people need is distributed along a normal distribution. This bell-shaped curve shows us that the average across a population is 8. But only around about 20 to 25% of a population would probably be in that area. And actually, if we look at the range of 7 to 10 hours, we're probably capturing a much larger proportion of the population, probably more like 75, 80% of the population are within that range. And if we go out to the sides, what we call the tails, you'll see that there are some people who genuinely do need a little amount of sleep, and there are some people who need a lot of sleep. This is just a normal distribution, and we can see this in many different biological or anthropometric measures, such as height, such as shoe size. If we were to measure everyone's shoes across the UK, we would probably find that in men in particular, the average shoe size is a size 8. But hopefully you would recognize that even though the average is a size 8, if you are a size 10, it's not a good idea to buy size 8 boots. The same thing applies to sleep. Just because the population average is 8, it doesn't mean it should be the thing you are aiming for. You need to understand your own sleep needs. So moving on from that first myth, we potentially need more than 8 hours. Some people potentially need less than 8 hours, and it will change a little bit as we go through our lives. Things like the menstrual cycle for women who menstruate can change the sleep duration very slightly across different phases of the cycle. Menopause is another lifespan stage that can certainly influence how much sleep women who menstruate need. So it does change slightly. Similarly, things like infection or injury can influence how much sleep we need as we try and improve our fitness or get back to good health. What we need to do is promote sleep. We need to promote the value of sleep. And you understand that it's not a luxury item. It's not something that you can shave away when you get busier. You do need to protect it because sleep is the bedrock of health, well-being and performance. The second thing is you need to protect your sleep. What I mean by that is it's really important to give yourself time to sleep. It's all well and good falling asleep on a sofa or falling asleep on a train on the way home, but they're not optimal sleep environments. And if we have a perfectly good bedroom, we need to use it. So we need to protect time within our day where we recognize that this is time to either begin the sleep process, to wind down, to start relaxing, to switch off from work, and then to get some sleep. Now, this will change. Now, I'm not the kind of person that says you need to be rigid and do the same thing every day. Your work, your life will change. There'll be busy periods. There'll be times when you've got lots of opportunity to get more sleep. So you can be flexible in how you do this. But the key message is if you can sleep, you should. It's a non-negotiable if you've got the time. Now, if you are pressed by other things, it's understandable that sometimes you just will not be able to protect the time to sleep, but you will have consequences. So if we can protect our sleep, we should do that. And what that means in reality is understand that we have not evolved to watch Netflix. We have not evolved to do emails or to read reports. If you're doing that late at night when you would typically be asleep, there has to be a recognition that that's probably not a good thing. That actually your ability to retain information, to process, to make decisions, to have clear judgment is improved by sleep, and your productivity and your performance will be improved if you use that time with your eyes closed sleeping than it would be trying to crush an extra through a couple of hours of work into the day. So we do need to protect our sleep. There's a concept called sleep procrastination where we put sleep off to do other things. Very common, completely understandable why some people would need to do that. If you're doing that every single day, that's going to cause problems. If it's occasional sleep procrastination because workload demands that you have to work a few hours, that is achievable if it's built on a good bank of sleep that you've had the rest of the time. So protecting our sleep is very important. The third and final is personalize. We need to personalize our sleep. We need to be able to have systems that work for us. This off-the-shelf approach to sleep will not work for everybody in the same way. Everyone's sleep is different. Everyone's sleep environment or sleep preferences are different. Some people will like complete darkness. Others will be able to sleep with a curtain open. Some people like a certain amount of cushioning on their mattress. Others like it to be particularly firm. We can personalize our sleep environment and we can personalize our sleep routine. We can personalize our wind down routine, the things that we think about, the behaviors that we enact in the run up to sleep will be unique to you. The advice would be trial and error. Test different things out until you find things that work for you and stay with them. And if they work, they work. It's tempting again to fall into the trap of listening to social media sleep experts telling you that what you're doing is wrong. The latest thing is around blue light devices like laptops, phones, iPads and such. Now, what the evidence shows us is that the light emitted from those devices is nowhere near sufficiently powerful to interrupt our sleep. And even if they do, they shorten our sleep onset latency. The amount of time it takes for you to fall asleep is interrupted, but by minutes. It's not really that significant. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes watching television to wind down or enjoys reading something on an iPad or a Kindle to wind down, well, that's an important part of your sleep process. So there's no point trying to change that. If it is helping you, there's no need to go down that fear mongering to say that that blue light will interrupt your sleep. The evidence suggests it doesn't. So just do what's comfortable to you. Now, there's obviously a tipping point there. There will be certain behaviors which will be interrupting your sleep, and we can personalize those to try and make sure that we're coming up with a system that works for you, which is consistent with a good night's sleep. Now, part of that is what we call sleep hygiene. I introduced sleep hygiene because, again, it's something that most people have heard of. So I'll talk about it and then skate over it quite quickly because ultimately it's common sense. A lot of sleep hygiene is common sense. You don't need me to tell you these things. We can break them down into two areas, which are effectively lifestyle factors and bedroom factors. What we think about when we look at lifestyle factors is it's often things to limit, and it's certain behaviors or it's certain substances that we know interrupt sleep. So for example, caffeine, we know interrupts the development or the progression of sleep pressure. So drinking it at the wrong time can interrupt sleep. That doesn't mean you shouldn't drink coffee. That just means you need to recognize that for you, the amount of time it takes to metabolize that coffee could be up to 10 hours. It could be 2 hours. We don't really know unless we get a test done. But if it is 10 hours, if you drink your last coffee at 1300, it still could be acting in your system when you're trying to go to sleep. So come up with a test and adjust system to understand in yourself and build that self-awareness of how much coffee do you need, how much coffee can you consume without interrupting your sleep later on in the night. So limiting caffeine is the advice. Similarly, limiting other stimulants like nicotine. It used to be that nicotine was only found in cigarettes. Now we find that people get their nicotine through vaping or through nicotine pouches that are placed on the gum, or chewing tobacco or other similar types of administration. What nicotine is doing is it's stimulating the brain. It's creating an alertness boost. So they're quite useful for certain times where we want that alerting boost. But when we're trying to sleep, we want the opposite of that. Now, nicotine stays in the system for a significantly shorter amount of time than caffeine does, but it does create withdrawal symptoms. So nicotine is highly, highly addictive, and it's actually the withdrawal symptoms that can wake you up. So nicotine gives you very fragmented sleep. You fall asleep and then you wake up a lot throughout the night. So again, limiting nicotine is a good idea. If you can come off nicotine products altogether, then I would recommend you do that. If you want to use nicotine, that's your choice. Just understand that it does influence the ability to fall asleep, and it can wake you up through withdrawal symptoms. In terms of other lifestyle behaviors, the recommendation is to limit alcohol, even though alcohol is a self-medicating sleep aid for a lot of people, this concept of a nightcap or having a drink to help you relax. The problem with alcohol is that it is interrupting sleep. We know that alcohol shortens overall sleep and it disrupts REM sleep. So while it may seem like it's sedating you, which it is a central nervous depressant, it is then influencing your brain's activity while you are sleeping. So the quality of that sleep is interrupted. And this is true of just one unit or one drink, one pint, one glass of wine will have some interrupting influence on your sleep. Now, again, alcohol is not the enemy. It's the timing and the dosage of it. Having a glass of wine with a meal is going to have significantly less of an effect than having 10 pints. Equally, having 10 pints every night is going to have much more of an effect than having 10 pints once in a blue moon. So you make those choices, but understand that sleep is affected by alcohol. Alcohol is not really a sleep aid. It is going to interrupt your sleep, and it's going to make everything worse when you wake up. We also need to manage our diet. The food that we take in can influence sleep. There are certain processes that go from foods all the way to the brain. We can't produce certain neurotransmitters or certain chemicals if we don't bring them into our diet. So we do need to manage our diet. Fall back on the advice that a good diet is something where you have moderation. It's nothing to excess. It's characteristic of a range of different micronutrients, different sources of whole food, limiting ultra-processed food, and getting adequate hydration. Now, I'm a nutritionist, but the research that has been published around this area suggests that sleep is bolstered by a low saturated fat diet, a high fiber diet, and effectively a whole food diet. There is no single food source which improves or significantly thwarts sleep. Despite the tales of cheese causing dreams or certain foods helping with sleep, the evidence just doesn't support that. So you don't necessarily need to completely avoid any food types unless they have things like caffeine in them, which you've already mentioned, things like dark chocolate, for example. We just need to focus on managing a healthy diet, just like you would for any other performance. Good diet will influence your sleep. And equally, good sleep will influence your diet choices because the hormones that are involved in appetite and satiety are closely linked to sleep. And if we don't get sufficient sleep, those hormones are out of balance. We feel hungrier and we do not feel full as quickly. The result is we often overconsume calories. So managing your diet is an essential part of sleep hygiene. Managing exercise is also really important. Generally speaking, the fitter you are, the better you sleep. There's some research recently published that actually showed that resistance training enabled better sleep compared with endurance training, or even combining resistance training with endurance training. So resistance training seems to be something that's quite important. Mechanisms maybe not that clear, but looking after yourself physically will improve your sleep. But we do need to manage it because the type of exercise at the wrong time can interrupt sleep. So you may remember I mentioned melatonin is a thermoregulatory hormone. It's bringing our core temperature down. We need to drop our core body temperature in order to initiate that sleep process. What can happen when we exercise is we can drive our core body temperature up. If we're doing HIIT training, if we're doing big lifts, we're driving our core body temperature up. And it's that core body temperature that can potentially interfere with sleep. So the timing and the type of exercise is important. From a sleep point of view, working out first thing in the morning is a very good idea. And especially if you're doing some resistance training. Again, the rule of thumb, generally speaking, the fitter you are, the better your system is, and the more efficient your system is, and the better your sleep. The next part of sleep hygiene is bedroom factors. This is your sleep environment. And again, highly personalized. You don't need necessarily to tick these off and make sure you get them right. But we need to look at things like the comfort level of our environment, the comfort level of the mattress and the bedclothes that we use, the amount of light, maybe using blackout blinds or eye masks, the amount of noise can be managed with ear. Maybe we can try and remove certain stressors or temptations away from the bedroom as well. So for example, if we've got an iPad right next to our bed, we might be tempted to watch that other episode of Netflix. So sometimes removing some of those temptations away from your bed. Pretty much self-explanatory, a lot of these things. And they shouldn't be recognized as a tick box. They're not things to check off. They're not things to try and achieve on a nightly basis. They're things to look at and use your common sense and think, is part of my bedroom environment really stopping me from getting to sleep? And if it is, it's easily amenable. It's easily changeable. We can move into certain behavioral factors as well. Something we call stimulus control. Stimulus control is linked to sleep hygiene in that we're looking at those bedroom factors and we're trying to make sure that our bedroom is the place that we sleep and we associate that space with sleep. So if you're using your bedroom as an office space, as a gym, as an entertainment area and a bedroom, it can cause disruption. So we want to try and remove those other things. Now, if you can't do that, if you can't watch television in a different room, if you in an accommodation where you've got our room and that's it, we can still look at how do we build an association between the bed and sleep. And we can do that by thinking we use certain parts of our room for gym exercises. Maybe we sit on the end of our bed when we're doing computer work. And when we are lying down with a head on a pillow, that's sleep time. So we can amend some of these behavioral factors quite easily. If we now move on to what we call these cognitive behavioral therapeutics, and these are things that we can look at to improve the quality of our sleep, or we can use it to remove the things that are maybe thwarting our sleep. And these things fall into three areas. They fall into the cognitive, the behavioral, and what we call relaxation therapies. Now, today we're going to focus on the cognitive, but we're going to focus on the cognitive because they are particularly useful for a lot of people. Now, the cognitive side of things, we're looking at targeting dysfunctional thinking, dysfunctional beliefs, or the things that's going on in our head that are potentially stopping us from sleeping. So, for example, a lot of people fail to down-regulate. They fail to just relax and bring themselves down. They're just whirring their mind. So cognitive therapeutics are particularly good for people who just can't stop thinking. They're always on. Therapeutics is about down-regulating the body. It's removing the tension from the body. Now, if we can calm the mind and calm the body, that allows sleep to take over. So relaxation therapeutics are good for people who are just holding on to that tenseness in their body, and we can try and down-regulate that, and we can introduce that calmness of the body to help us sleep. Behavioral therapeutics, as I've said before, leans into that sleep hygiene slightly. It's about shaping up sleep practices, making sure that what we're doing is aligning to good sleep. We're trying to ultimately improve something called sleep efficiency, which is the time you spend in bed and the time you spend asleep. And we're looking at the comparison. So if you've got a sleep efficiency of 90%, that would suggest that 90% of the time that you are in bed, you are asleep. If your sleep efficiency is 50%, clearly half of the time is spent awake. half the time is spent asleep. Behavioral therapeutics can try and change that. We're trying to grade up the sleep efficiency through lots of different techniques, things that are called, for example, sleep restriction. We've mentioned stimulus control techniques. There are a few other behaviors that we can look at to try and tighten up those sleep practices. So this is particularly useful for people who maybe have fragmented sleep, where sleep is not a continuous block throughout a night. So let's talk about some cognitive therapeutics. As I've said, this is something that I see a lot. People often will report these things. And what I want you to consider, if this is you, is maybe just to consider the question, what do you think about when you're not able to sleep? What are the kind of thoughts that are going through your mind? And this is important because we can align specific interventions with types of thinking. The research shows that we can classify the type of sleep restricted thinker and we can provide a personalized approach. And when I've asked that question before, when I say to people, what goes through your mind when you are not able to sleep? I typically get a series of answers. On those nights when people can't sleep, the problem seems to be that my mind keeps turning things over in my head. I'm unable to empty my head. I can't get my sleep pattern into a proper routine. My thinking just takes a long time to unwind, and I find it hard to physically let go and relax my body. These typically are the things I hear about. The worrying mind is number one, that inability to just stop thinking. Now, if that's you, we can help. So the first one that we're going to look at is something called cognitive control. Cognitive control as an intervention is specifically useful for people who are kept awake by rehearsing and planning thoughts. The people that can't get their to-do list out of their head, or they're overthinking or ruminating on the events that have happened in the day. So what cognitive control is about is ultimately putting the day to rest. And we can go through a process of blocking out an amount of time in the day. It doesn't need to be long. It can be 10 to 15 minutes, but we need consistency in doing this every single day. We take a piece of paper, we take a journal or a notebook, and we write the things that are in our head. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is we're conducting a preemptive strike on those types of thoughts that keep us awake. We're removing those thoughts. We're getting them out of our head. We're providing amount of time where we're allowed to ruminate. We're allowed to plan. It gives us freedom to do that. And we effectively think with ink. We get it out of our head, we put it onto paper. Now, you could take that journal, you could take a piece of paper, and you could put that on your bedside table. And if you do find yourself overthinking as you're trying to fall asleep, or if you wake up in the middle of the night and your mind is whirring again with these rehearsing and planning thoughts, we can just put them to one side by writing them down, and we come back to them in the morning. It's again, you're trying to let go so that your body can just take over. You're trying to calm the mind, taking it out of your head and putting it onto paper. The next one that we're going to look at is something called a paradoxical intention. Now, this stems from the work of a psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl, who talked about paradoxical intentions. This idea that the thing that we're trying to do often is the thing that stops us from actually achieving what we're setting out to do. So in the context of sleep, we're trying to basically give up trying. It's the effort of trying to sleep that stops us sleeping. We need to stop thinking about turning on that sleep switch and actually recognize that it's not a conscious process, that we need to let go and we need to allow that physiology to take over. So paradoxical intention is actually doing the opposite of what it is that we're trying to do. So in the context of sleep, instead of trying to fall asleep, we try and stay awake. And actually in trying to stay awake, we're able to then actually remove our attention from the thing that was stopping us from sleeping, and we just allow our physiology to take over. So it's a really simple process where we just try and stay awake for as long as we can. And we can do that in a few different ways. We can do it with our eyes open, we can do it with our eyes closed, but we're just trying to remove that worry. We're trying to remove that effort. We're giving up on any effort to fall asleep. Give up the concern about being awake. Sleep isn't something we can switch on and off. Give up on concern yourself with trying to do that, and just keep that mindset for as long as you can. You're not trying to fall asleep anymore, and your body will just take over. Maybe you could even just consider, what's the worst thing that can happen? You stay awake for as long as you can. What's the worst thing that can happen? And actually, by paradoxically thinking about the worst case scenario, it actually lessens its effect. You don't feel as bad. So paradoxical intention is a highly effective and very useful technique. The next cognitive therapeutic is something called articulatory suppression. Now, this is a very simple technique where you're trying to occupy your attention by filling it with something that you control. So rather than those thoughts that are creeping in, so thinking about thinking is that idea where you just can't stop thoughts coming into your head. They will just constantly just creep in over and over and over again. The things like the randomness of a TV show you once saw or someone you met 20 years ago. We can quieten down those jumpy, intrusive cognitions by simply replacing it, buffering it, if you will, with something you control. So you can use anything really, but a good thing is just mouthing the word the. You're not necessarily shouting the word, you're more miming the word. But we're repeating that word the every 2 seconds with your eyes closed and see if you can keep going for 5 minutes. Now, it's dull enough that you probably will not be able to do that for 5 minutes. Now, what you can do is come up with any word you like, but really you're trying to down-regulate. So it's something boring like the, saying it every couple of seconds, miming that word, playing it out in your head and repeat for as long as you can. That is basically buffering out those negative thoughts. It's thinking like your brain as a pint glass. If that glass is half empty, there's half the capacity of the glass for intrusive thoughts to jump in. Instead of trying to cap that glass off, we're just now filling the glass with things that we control. We control the cadence of the word the. So we can't multitask by thinking about 7 things at once, and it effectively helps us to fall asleep. The next one we're going to look at is imagery or mindfulness type techniques. Now, mindfulness techniques is probably equally a relaxation therapeutic as it is a cognitive one. But these are particularly good for people who are hypervigilant, that they cannot take their attention away from sights and sounds and stimuli in the surrounding areas in the bedroom. So, for example, a dripping tap or a light on a TV or something like that. The mindfulness type activities such as a body scan, which you can get on YouTube, you can find these very easily. You're trying to release tension from the body whilst understanding where your thoughts are pointing. So we're focusing our attention, or focusing our thoughts. With imagery, we're trying to use our brain and our psyche to create an experience. So imagery isn't necessarily visualization. It's not seeing something. It's imagining an experience. And a very simple technique you could try is imagine you are in a place that you know very, very well, and you want to create the experience in your imagination. So you might go back to a bedroom that you slept in when you were young, and you're trying to imagine what the texture of the wallpaper feels like on your fingers when you rub your hand across it. You might be looking at the posters on the wall or the feeling of the carpet on your toes as you walk over it. You're trying to create a multi-sensory experience. Imagine you're in that room and take in all the information, the sights, the sounds, the smells, the touches, and then remove yourself from that room and walk across the landing, doing the same thing in a different room, the different touches, the smells, the sounds. What do you imagine you would feel if you were in that place? And move around that space, move around that house, going through the bedrooms, going to the bathroom, moving down the stairs into different parts of the room. That process will allow you to move your thoughts away from the effort of trying to sleep and the effort of listening to all these things that are bothering you. And it will just allow sleep to take over. So you will fall asleep. You'll find that you probably don't know where you were in the house when you fell asleep. This one is very effective if you are somebody who is a hypervigilant thinker. Another common one, probably with the advent of wearable technologies, is people who are catastrophic thinkers about their sleep. They've maybe read a sleep book. They're now worried they're going to get Alzheimer's. Their wearables telling them they're not getting enough sleep. They've fixated on 8 hours and their wearable tells them not, or their sleep scores down in the 50%. Now, these people can catastrophize about that type of sleep. They can worry that it means something, that it means that they're going to get ill, that it means that they are going to have a bad day tomorrow because they're cognitively impaired. Now, what we need to do is rationalize this thinking. We need to look at different ways of restructuring this and effectively asking yourself, where's the evidence for this? Is there an alternative explanation? Could there be something else that I don't understand? We first have to recognize that our thinking is irrational, and we then need to replace it with something that's going to help us, something that's rational, something that is going to move us away from that catastrophic thinking. So we could maybe look at the likelihood of these things happening. We could consider the worst case scenario versus the best case scenario. We could ask for evidence that this is something that could happen. We could even ask ourselves the question, in a week's time, am I even going to remember feeling this catastrophic or this anxious about sleep? And they probably won't. So we can go through different techniques around rationalizing this type of catastrophic thinking. Now, on the wearable topic, I do wear a smartwatch. It does give me sleep metrics, but as a sleep specialist, I do not use them. Very, very rarely look at my own sleep scores. I just do not use them because for me, they're not that accurate and they don't tell me anything I don't already know. So if you do enjoy your wearable and you enjoy the data, back on, you keep doing it, but don't get too caught up in them. They're not medical grade. They're not research grade. They are wet finger in the air accurate when it comes to measuring your sleep because they don't measure anything from the brain. And remembering that sleep is of the brain, for the brain, and by the brain. We need to understand what's happening inside the cranium if we're truly going to understand sleep. And wearables just can't do that because they're on the wrist. So don't worry too much or don't get tied up too much in the data that's coming off your wearable. The final cognitive therapeutic that we're going to look at is problem solving. And this typically is relevant for people who have big picture thoughts. So maybe they're worrying about larger things in their life, maybe their finances, maybe it's global warming or geopolitics, but there's big picture thoughts. Now, these are going to be things that are going to occupy your thoughts because they're very important, they're very meaningful. Now, what we can do in problem solving is actually more of a behavioral therapeutic, is that we need to really set some time aside, maybe up to an hour during the day, to do some problem solving. Now, if you are in a position where the nature of your job and the problems that you get in your job are stopping you from sleeping, then you need to be able to set some time aside to attack those problems and consider how do we reduce them so that they don't interrupt your sleeping at a later time. So it's really a behavioral therapeutic. It's giving yourself the space to spend time thinking about these important issues and consider what can you do about them. If they're things that are not within your control, again, we can still help with problem solving by considering how can we shift our attention and move it back into things that we can control. So we need to set some time aside, have an action plan, and also invest in some what we call implementation intentions so that our thoughts about how we're going to address these problems are converted into action. So that's it for today. I intentionally kept this down to approximately an hour. There's a lot to get after when it comes to sleep, but I wanted to leave you with some cognitive techniques that you could use immediately. I'm happy to help people if they've got any questions. Please do reach out to me. And thank you for your time. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. That brings us to the end of this special episode and to the end of Series 3. Thank you for listening and following the podcast across the series. If this is your first episode, I hope it's been useful and that you can dive into the back catalogue at your convenience. If you found this episode useful, please rate and review the podcast on your preferred platform. Every download, referral, rating, and review improves the visibility and helps the content to reach people who can use it. I'd also ask you to share the podcast. Send it to a colleague, your team, or anyone working in a high-demand role where performance matters. Word of mouth is still the main way that this podcast grows. We'll be back with more in the next series, and until then, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.